Welcome to the first webinar in the Our Faith, Our Vote Issue Education video series. The United Church of Christ's Our Faith, Our Vote campaign is designed to equip the faith community for nonpartisan engagement in the elections through voter registration, issue education, and voter empowerment. We hope you will use this video and others in the series to get informed about the issues at stake in the upcoming elections, issues that our faith calls us to address. In this video, we will discuss the topic of environmental justice and climate with the help of our Justice and Peace Policy Fellow, Madison Mayhew, and a panel of faith leaders well informed in the issue area. Madison, can you start us off and introduce our panelists?
Thanks so much, Jessie. I'm really excited for our conversation because we have a trio of wonderful speakers today. First, we have Shantha Ready Alanso, Executive Director of Creation Justice Ministries, who is based on the West Coast in California. We have Berndt, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ, based in Cleveland, Ohio. And lastly, we have Reverend Michael Malcom, the founder and Executive Director of the People's Justice Council and Executive Director of Interfaith Power and Light of Alabama. Thank you all so much for joining us today as we talk about environmental justice and climate issues in relation to the upcoming 2020 election. As we begin, let's lay some groundwork for why this issue is so important for people of faith. Can each of you speak about how your faith and care for creation inform your participation in voting and the election?
Yeah, I guess I can start.
Be happy to do that. For me, our first calling as Christians is to care for God's creation. But more than that, I feel like right now is a particularly important moment for Christians when it comes to this election. I understand that right now we're living in what some people call a Kairos Moment. That's a Greek biblical word that has this meaning that even in a time of crisis, God's active presence can be felt. God's grace is arising in that moment. And so right now we're in this time where there are multiple overlapping crises. We've got the climate crisis, we've got the inequality crisis, we've got the coronavirus crisis. And it's crucial that we have a government with the best elected officials who's representing and embodying our values to step forward and to address these three overlapping crisis situations with the full might and power of our government. And so when we step into the voting booth, it's the time for us to be asking ourselves, right, am I voting in a way that reflects my caring for God's creation? Am I voting in a way that reflects my love for my neighbors? Those are all basic values that really have an impact on how our government then lives out values in responding to these critical crisis situations faced today.
Thank you. Do any of our other panelists have additional thoughts?
I'm glad to build on that.
I'll let you go.
Okay. Yeah. So I would say in any ordinary time, I would consider voting to be a civic sacrament. That's the phrase that was coined by Father Ted Hesburgh, the former president of the University of Notre Dame, where I went to school. And he really saw voting as an action that binds us together and is deeply symbolic of our role as active citizenship. So it's an opportunity to connect us to each other, connect us to our values, similar to the way that we would think of a sacrament. A small s sacrament is what you'd call it. And I also think of voting as a responsibility and as an extension of our role in the larger creation. So all of creation, all of the natural world has a way of governing itself. Different species have different ways of decision-making and figuring out how they're going to live and be in the world together. And democracy is the tool that we have to decide how to live and be in the world together. And all the other species are subject to the decisions that we make in our democracy. And, frogs can't vote, and they're having a hard time right now. And bees can't vote and they're having a hard time right now. And so as we think expansively about our moral responsibility when we go to the voting booth, we have to think about the whole of creation. And to echo what Brooke said, this is not any ordinary election. So the principles I just shared are true of any time, but now is an extraordinary time when so much is at stake for our neighbors, especially our neighbors that are suffering from the COVID-19 crisis that is going on right now. And before that, there were a host of environmental justice issues that were urgent also. People are getting sick and dying. That's nothing new for many communities across the country that need more just laws.
I'd add to that and also say that, demonstration without legislation only leads to frustration. With the amount of rollbacks that are happening right now, it's not just enough for us to get in the streets and raise our fist and pump our fist, though I'm one who enjoys that type of camaraderie and rah-rah. However, I think that now is a time when we've got to dig deep and go and represent for our communities and represent on behalf of our communities, because unfortunately, corporations and various other special interest groups have used this COVID crisis as a means of cloaking a lot of things that actually harm community. So now is the time for community leaders and in particular faith leaders to stand up, to stand out for those that they serve.
Thank you so much for those answers and for highlighting the complexity and of the issues that we face right now. And we'll talk about COVID in a minute, but I think something that is also incredibly large that we are seeing fold or unfold every day is the climate crisis. And we know that it's not only facing us right now, but it will be facing future generations. And as we think about going to the polls in November, what should folks be asking their candidates to ensure those running for office are thinking about solutions that work for everyone, to ensure those who are most at risk are being kept in mind in light of the climate crisis?
Let me jump on that one first, because I'd be remiss if I didn't do the shameless plug. We have the EACV, or VICA is what we call it, document with U.S. Climate Action Network, that actually lays out a platform for equitable and inclusive and diverse and just transition. And I think that particular document was put together by a conglomerate of various organizations in the environmental movement, and it really centers us in a place of justice and equity. And if we could really get behind that and help to push that, it will help to on the things that it'll take. It's also inclusive of the Green New Deal, and it's a companion of the Green New Deal. And so to even push that alongside will help to get us to a just society where everyone is treated with fairness and equity.
That's great. Can you, for those who may not be familiar with what a just transition is, can you, either you, Reverend Malcom, or anyone else, give a little bit background of what that is and what that looks like and why it's so important?
Yeah, I definitely don't want to be the only one speaking and dominate the whole time. So I've got two experts who are very much capable, much more capable than I in speaking about these issues.
Yeah, so just transition was a phrase that originally came out of the AFL-CIO as a way to frame the shift from an extractive economy to a more sustainable economy that also supports workers. And as we look at just transition issues from the moving from the extractive paradigm, we're really looking for not only a future that is more sustainable for the earth, but one that is sustainable for workers and treats workers justly. So we're looking for a blue-green justice paradigm for blue-collar people and for the earth.
Thank you for that clarification. And I may jump around a little bit, but this past General Synod, the UCC became one of the first, if not the first, church denomination to endorse the Green New Deal. And a huge proponent of the Green New Deal is just transition. And Brooks, could you walk us through a little bit of what that is and why the Green New Deal is so important?
Sure. The Green New Deal is really a call for legislation that is seeking a bold government action to address climate and inequality in an all-out manner over the next 10 years. And so it's become really significant with regard to this conversation because it's become something of a litmus test, and sometimes a litmus test can be a good thing. You know, it's an indicator if a candidate supports it or doesn't support it. It's an indicator of just how serious they are about addressing climate and inequality. It's an indicator of, you know, do they sense the urgency of these matters? And if they sense the urgency, then they recognize that we need bold and big government action. As Bill McKibben noted, actually, in responding to the UCC's passing of that resolution, is that the Green New Deal is really the first proposed legislation package that is commensurate, that matches the scope of the climate crisis, right? And so it's really important to come out, you know, as people of faith to say, yes, we support that, and then to call on our elected officials to support it as well, and to hold them accountable to just how important this moment is to act with boldness, with urgency, and to really prioritize this as a commitment of theirs. And I'll just say that while we often talk about the Green New Deal as something that's kind of at the level of Congress and the president, it's really also important to be talking about the Green New Deal and this kind of all-out call for mobilization at the local and state levels. Really, the local and state levels have been leading the way in some parts of the country in passing legislation that reflects this kind of Green New Deal commitment. And we need more of that. We need more local and state elected officials who are willing to lead the way, because ultimately, you know, if this is more of a trickle-up phenomenon that we're hoping for, right? As people at the grassroots push for this kind of change, eventually there's going to become the groundswell necessary for it to happen at a national level. And so it's a really critical issue to bring before candidates, whether it's a virtual town hall or other forms of advocating with candidates.
Thank you for discussing that. I think, you know, that's such an important piece of who we are as a UCC, and for folks to be mindful of as we move forward in the election. I think something else that is important to remember as we head to the polls in November, and as we think about who we want to vote for in Congress and other leadership positions, I've been, as you were processing, I was also thinking about how whoever sits in the presidential office also has the power to appoint cabinet members and how important those roles are. And as we've witnessed, and by the current administration, we've seen significant rollbacks of important EPA protections. Can one of you discuss what is at stake in terms of these important regulations and why it is significant to have someone who upholds these significant protections?
This is Shantha. I'm glad to jump in on that. So we need a leader who is going to not only uphold the existing laws, but is going to strengthen and improve them. So there's first got to be a reversal of the damage that's been done, which has been devastating. I mean, we have devastated the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. We have messed up all the methane pollution regulations that were going to put us closer on track to the Paris goals that we had. I think that the UCC understands better than most faith communities that we need a different paradigm. So it's not only about upholding existing, but creating something really new. And so the Green New Deal is definitely a part of that. But from out of the administration, the Congress would have to do the Green New Deal. Out of the administration, there are many things that a president could do in their first 100 days to not only repair the damage, but also to strengthen rules by initiating new rulemakings that would be much more stringent and respectful of creation and vulnerable communities.
So I'd like to tell you all about Lil Jon Jon, who's 8 years old, who lives in North Birmingham. Lil Jon Jon lives in a generational home, meaning that his grandparents and parents have all lived in this home. His grandparents paid off the home, and they've just been able to pass it down from generation to generation. However, this community that Lil Jon Jon lives in is surrounded by industrial pollution. Lil Jon Jon has asthma that he developed from birth because of poor air quality. But Lil Jon Jon is now trapped in his house because of COVID and can't get out, can't go to school. And instead of regulations allowing for the pollution to decrease, now there are no regulations or no enforcement of these regulations because of EPA rules. And so they've doubled down on pollution, and Lil Jon Jon has to live in this constant torture 24/7 because of everything that's going on. This is why it's important that we get out and we vote for leadership that will look out for Lil Jon Jon and his family, whose house is now continuing to keep them in this cycle of poverty and Lil Jon Jon sick. These are the things that move us to not only hear these stories, but to see these things. But it should move us as leaders to get out and talk to our congregations about the things and vote for the things that are of interest to them, and to be watchmen on the wall for those things that aren't of interest for them.
Thank you. That's such a powerful testimony to the significant moment that we face, and for the role that leaders have. And I think that's a perfect transition to talk about the ways in which COVID-19 has impacted vulnerable populations that were already at risk of the climate crisis. And as folks already involved as faithful advocates addressing environmental justice, I wonder if you could about that makes up these vulnerable populations, and why is COVID-19 particularly harmful to them, and how what overlap is there, and as we've already been talking about, the significant moment of the elections and addressing these things.
Yeah, I'll take the first stab at that. What we know about COVID-19 is that it doesn't affect everyone equally, and that environmental injustice plays a huge role in that. So one can't fully understand racial disparities with COVID-19 death rates without understanding the history of inequality that brought us to this moment. And so studies and statistics have demonstrated that there's this link between toxic air pollution and increased COVID death rates. So when residents of a community have had their lungs assaulted for years by air pollution, they then become especially vulnerable to this virus that attacks lungs, right? And so that's why when you look at the places in our country that are experiencing these high COVID death rates, often it's places that have been for years experiencing high rates of pollution. And in the United States, that means you're talking about communities of color, and you're talking about low-income communities. You're talking about specific geographic regions like Cancer Alley, which stretches from Baton Rouge down to New Orleans. And right now in that area, we're seeing some of the highest COVID death rates across the country. And it all has to do with this history of injustice, this history of environmental pollution in these communities, which are predominantly Black often and predominantly low income. And so that's really the key thing to keep in mind here. And I appreciate Michael's putting a human face to it, and to connect this conversation with the conversation about EPA regulations and rules. I think it's important to sometimes do a linguistic intervention, because when we call regulations and rules, what we're really talking about is protections for kids, right? It's kids who physically, biologically are most vulnerable to these toxic air pollutants. And so, we're talking about rolling back protections, the things that keep our kids safe, right? And so it's important that we have elected officials who are not openly, vocally enthusiastic about supporting super polluter industries and companies. It's not a secret. They're pretty open and expressive about it. And so we need people that are open and expressive and enthusiastic about protecting children, about protecting the communities in Cancer Alley, about protecting communities in the Houston area. That's what we need, people in office who are really have a zeal and a passion for justice on behalf of those communities and with those communities.
I'd like to just build on that in terms of the inequity. One of the issues that has also come to a head with the COVID-19 crisis has been access to clean, safe water. And how unequal that is in our country. And if we look at some of the hot spots for outbreaks, Detroit and Navajo land, those are two areas where people lack access to safe, clean water. In the city of Detroit, they claimed that they were going to put a moratorium on all utility shutoffs for people who were unable to pay their water bills. But in effect, the companies were not able to implement that. And, maybe a month after that declaration was made, I think upwards of 2,000 households still were without safe, clean running water in their households, and yet we're being exhorted every day to wash our hands. In Navajo land, access to safe, clean water has always been a struggle. Many households have just lived without running water for many, many years. And we're seeing the inequities in access to safe water manifest themselves in COVID-19 vulnerability as well.
Since Shantha brought up moratoriums, that does bring in the economic injustices as well, and the utility shutoffs or the lack thereof when it comes down to moratoriums, in particular for those who are the most vulnerable. So in Alabama, I just actually read an article and posted it today that they never did declare a moratorium with our utilities, and now the utilities are starting to move back into shutting off utilities now. Here's the problem, and here's what I see, and perhaps again this is prophetically, but there's gonna come a time real soon that they're gonna weaponize utilities to force people to go back out and start working. In the South, you cannot afford to live in the South without air conditioner. There's just no way you can do it. And now that we're coming into the summer hours or the summer season, and it's going to get extremely hotter here because of climate change, people are going to be trapped indoors, and they can't afford to be trapped indoors without some cooling or some AC or fans going, because they literally die in those houses. but what happens when they have to get out and work and go in unsafe conditions because these utilities that they need desperately to live are being shut off. So, you know, as communities of faith, again, I'm going to continue to challenge each time I finish a statement on this call. I challenge us to not look to go back into our four walls of our sanctuaries, but to get out in the streets and advocate for us to continue to live.
Thank you so much. You all make such important points about how, you know, this isn't just a single issue. It impacts so many different other facets of inequality, and really it's intersectional in a lot of different ways. And I'm grateful to you for bringing your perspectives. I want to be mindful of time, and I have a few other questions, but Reverend Malcom and Reverend Berndt, you both are co-chairs of the Creation Justice webinars, and you are regularly creating content for and are in contact with local UCC clergy and others. What are ways clergy and congregations can engage around these issues? And do you have any examples of churches who are currently engaged?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about something that came out of the UCC Council for Climate Justice. It's called the Creation Care Voter Pledge. And basically, we partnered with the Environmental Voter Project. And what they do is they track, every year there's over 5,000 elections in the United States. And they track all 5,000 of those elections. And people who take a pledge to vote their values are then notified and reminded that they made this moral obligation to vote when they took this pledge to vote their values, and that they have an election coming up. And it doesn't matter if it's local or national. It's important to get out there and to be a consistent voter, because elected officials and people running for office take note of who's voting and what they are bringing into the voting booth in terms of what they prioritize. And so with our Creation Care Voter Pledge, it says simply that I will always prioritize caring for God's creation and how I vote. You know, when I vote, I'm putting love into action for every living creature and for every economically and racially marginalized community that suffers from environmental harm. And so you're taking those values, you're pledging to take those values into the voting booth. And so we've had a church in Boston, Church of the Covenant. It's both UCC and Presbyterian. And what they did in 2018, on the lead up to the election, was they invited those worshiping with them one Sunday to take the Creation Care Voter Pledge. And then people put them in the offering plate that Sunday, right? And so that's something, we've got the pledge online, and we've got it so that you can print it out and have people putting them in the offering plate on Sunday. So a really good way for churches to say it's important that we vote and that we vote our values, and here's a way in which we can make that commitment tangible.
Yeah, I am ambassadors for the Faith Climate Voter Pledge with Interfaith Power and Light. That is also something that's online that you as faith leaders can push with your congregations, as well as I'm one of the national organizers for the Arm in Arm with US Can. And you can find more information about that at www.arminarmforclimate.org. But we're setting up hubs nationwide where we want to really start advocating for just and equitable society. And one of the ways that we're doing that is through humanitarian efforts. If you, again, want to learn more about that, you can go to www.arminarmforclimate.org and get more information to get involved that way. And that is something that's extremely suitable for congregations to take part in.
Shantha, did you have something to add?
I'll I'll wait till the next question. Thanks.
Okay. I did actually have one more issue question for you. I know that Creation Justice Ministries does a lot of work on protecting lands. Can you talk a little bit about what is at stake in regards to our wonderful national monuments and other sacred lands in the U.S.?
So unfortunately, over the last few years, Madison, we have seen the largest unprotection of lands that were once protected in US history. So we lost legal protections for large swaths of land in Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument and Bears Ears National Monument. And those lands were of particular interest and significance to Indigenous people in this country. And so we are very much looking forward to an opportunity to not only reverse the losses, but again, to strengthen and rethink the way that we do conservation protection. And I am going to be very, very much looking forward to the opportunity to engage in conservation in a more thoughtful way in the future through an initiative called the Campaign for Nature, to protect 30% of the natural world or more by 2030. And scientists are telling us that we need to do this worldwide if we're going to be resilient to the climate and biodiversity crises that we're facing. And that if we allow nature to do its job, nature will protect us in the midst of these crises. But if we continue to disrespect the order of creation and impede nature's ability to be resilient, as creation is designed to be, we will suffer so much more. And so we are excited about the 30 by 30 initiative. There is 30 by 30 legislation right now in both the House and Senate, but I would really hope and expect for that to move forward in a more substantial way with new leadership that cares about these things. So that is something to look for as we vote, is where people stand on these conservation measures.
Definitely, thank you. Being mindful of our time, I have one final question, and I'd like to point this towards Reverend Berndt. When we think about the UCC, we think of, especially in regards to environmental advocacy, we know that the UCC has a legacy of being on the forefront of environmental activism and advocacy. As we round up, can you briefly walk us through this legacy and how it relates to the election?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Thanks for that question. One of my beliefs is that hope isn't just about the future, but hope also is something that arises out of the past. And in the UCC, we have this rich tradition of environmental justice struggle. And so one of the things is to really recognize is that faith communities were at the heart of the birth of the environmental justice movement back in the 1980s. You had people like Dolly Burwell, Leon White, and Benjamin Chavis, who all became central leaders as that movement got started in Warren County, North Carolina. And the situation that they're facing there was that the state of North Carolina had decided that they were going to dump a bunch of toxic waste, PCBs, a known carcinogen, into Warren County, which was the county that had the highest percentage of Black population in the state and was also one of the poorest counties in the state. And so people began to rally and train themselves for nonviolent civil disobedience. And ultimately, when the first dump trucks rolled in, they put their bodies on the line. And they got arrested, they went to jail, and it sparked a national, a moment of national awakening. And so people from all over the country came, and over 500 people got arrested over the next 6 weeks. And so it's out of that history of courage where people, out of love and care for their kids often, were willing to make really substantial sacrifices and commitments. And that's a history that I think should continue to inspire us. and that we can continue to be part of that every time we walk into a voting booth, because we want elected officials who heed justice advocates rather than arrest and jail justice advocates, right? And so when we vote, we have the opportunity to put into office people who are going to be advancing environmental protections rather than rolling back environmental protections. And so voting is really an extension of this history that is full of courage, full of inspiration, and is really something for us to honor and to cherish in how we vote.
Thank you so much. This has been such an incredible conversation, and I know will be a wonderful resource for our UCC members, and I hope for others as well. I am going to pass it back to Jessie now as she closes for us.
Thank you, Madison, and thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists for sharing your voices with us. And thank you also to our viewers for watching this video in the Our Faith, Our Vote Issue Education series. We hope you'll use this information to inform your participation in the election season, and that you'll share what you have learned with those in your congregation and in your communities. Please take a look at our videos and resources on our website at ourfaithourvote.org. The resources mentioned in this video will also be shared on that site. Thank you.